So we're talking about the Kennedy presidency, the early years. They've just gotten elected in the second closest election in American history.
So our next test, is this packet going to be on it?
No, it is not.
That's the stuff on the other.
Yeah, good question. No, the package is going to be good information for you. Now, does anybody remember what Franklin Roosevelt called his administration? The New Deal. How about Truman? Fair Deal. How about Eisenhower? No. Modern Republicanism. The name of Kennedy's administration will be the New Frontier. It's called the New Frontier. So in American history, the years that John F. Kennedy was president was known as the New Frontier. And when Kennedy took office, this New Frontier had 4 objectives for the United States. 4 things that this New Frontier or Kennedy administration was going to provide the United States. This was his philosophy. This is things he wanted to do. The first objective of the Kennedy New Frontier was to build up the military with conventional weapons. To build up the military with conventional weapons. Kyle, what are conventional weapons? They're what? Conventional. Or what's an N word for that? Yeah, non-nuclear. Okay? So, to build up the military with conventional or non-nuclear weapons. Kennedy is going to try to get this nuclear weapons situation under control with Russia. He's going to try to sign a test ban treaty and all kinds of things, and we'll talk about that later. But he wanted to build up our military with non-nuclear weapons, with conventional weapons. Another thing Kennedy wanted to do, one of his objectives, is he wanted to pass the Russians in the what? Race for space. He wanted to pass the Russians in the race for space. Wanted to pass the Russians in the race for space. Another thing he wanted to do that my mother appreciated and why she was a loyal Democrat her entire life is he wanted to provide medical care for the elderly. He wanted to provide medical care for the elderly. And you should thank him for this because things would be a lot different as we sat in this classroom today. The 4th objective Kennedy's New Frontier had was to provide government money for what? Education. Yep, government money for education. So, the 4 objectives of the Kennedy New Frontier was to build up the military with conventional or non-nuclear weapons, to pass the Russians in the race for space, to provide medical care for the elderly, and to provide government money for education. Okay, now, it was very important to get the job done that Kennedy have a very strong presidential cabinet. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is the presidential cabinet of John F. Kennedy. And these names I'm going to give you are going to be crucial names to know from now until we get completely through even the Johnson administration, because these are people who are going to hang in there. Okay, now Kennedy did a wonderful job. Historians will say he might have had the best balanced cabinet in American history. He had a very, very strong cabinet. Obviously, who's part of the cabinet? The vice president, which is Lyndon B. Johnson. So the vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about each one of these guys. Lyndon B. Johnson was the former Senate Majority Leader, okay, before he became Vice President. That's the highest ranking member of the Senate. And when he left to become Vice President, you don't have to write this down, but we'll get to it. A fellow by the name of Mike Mansfield, Democratic Senator from Montana, became Senate Majority Leader and served in that position longer than any man in American history. And this was after Johnson left. So Johnson was a former Senate Majority Leader, very, very popular politician from Texas. Very persuasive politician from Texas. Okay? Very forceful. Didn't match up with John Kennedy much philosophically, but we talked about him wanting Johnson to secure the Southern vote in the election of 1960. Kennedy's Secretary of State was a fellow by the name of Dean Rusk. This guy right here on the Time magazine, Dean Rusk. Dean Rusk was a Republican. Remember, Kennedy's a Democrat. He was a very quiet, calm Republican from Georgia. And prior to becoming Secretary of State, he was president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Now, you've heard of the Rockefellers. We talked about Nelson Rockefeller, very wealthy Republican family out of New York. Well, Dean Rusk was a very quiet, calm Republican from Georgia who at the time of his selection was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation. Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, right here. Robert S. McNamara. Oops. Robert S. McNamara. He was a Democrat. Robert S. McNamara was a Democrat. He was a native of California, and at the time, he was president of Ford Motor Company. I looked her up. Yep. He was president of Ford Motor Company.
What was his position?
He was the Secretary of Defense. Robert S. McNamara. He was a Democrat. He was a native of California and president of Ford Motor Company during the time of his appointment. Now, I looked this up because I like the fact that Keller pays attention. He actually was named president of Ford Motor Company in 1960, and he was the first non-Ford family member ever to hold that position. Prior to that, it was always somebody within the Ford family, relative, that was president. And he was named president in 1960, but he didn't stay there long because in January of 61, he became Secretary of Defense. So that was saying something about Robert McNamara. If he was a non-Ford family member and they made him president of Ford Motor Company. Very influential, becomes a very positive and very strong Secretary of Defense, not only through the Kennedy years, but through the Johnson years and into Vietnam. Okay, the Secretary of the Treasury that Kennedy chose was a fellow by the name of C. Douglas Dillon. C. Douglas Dillon.
Gotta get myself together on where these are at.
C. Douglas Dillon. Oh, here, C. Douglas Dillon. Now Dillon, C. Douglas Dillon was a very wealthy Republican New York investment banker at the time of his selection. Very wealthy Republican New York investment banker. To give you an idea what kind of money he was worth, he actually at one time donated $20 million to the New York Metropolitan Museum. This guy had some bucks and he knew how to run with finances. So good choice. C. Douglas Dillon, a Republican, very wealthy New York investment banker who one time donated $20 million to the New York Metropolitan Museum. There's a guy that's got some cash. $20 million in the 60s. So he had some money and knew how to run a financial situation. Very good choice. Another position in Kennedy's cabinet was that of press secretary. What does the press secretary do? Anybody know, Vilo? Do you know what the press secretary does? Besides be on his phone? What does he do? What's the press secretary do? So, sort of, he announces anything the president's going to do. He speaks for the president. He tells where he's going, what he's doing, those types of things. And the man that Kennedy chose was someone he knew very well, Pierre Salinger. Pierre Salinger. See him up there, Blaine? I had these orders.
Oh, right there. By the light.
Right here. Now this is interesting. I'm very proud of this. This is an old Polaroid photo, one of those ones they took in the 60s. That's an old Polaroid photo with Pierre's signature. And here's a better signature here. But Pierre Salinger was the press secretary. You'll hear a lot about him in future lectures. He was an associate of the Kennedy family. He worked for the Kennedy family during John Kennedy's election. Who was the campaign manager of John Kennedy's election? Anybody remember? His brother, Robert. Well, when Robert Kennedy ran for president later in '68, Pierre Salinger is going to be his campaign manager. So Pierre Salinger has been with the family forever politically. And when he was elected president, Kennedy announced that Pierre Salinger would be the press secretary. Okay, the next important position was National Security Advisor. And the man that Kennedy chose, kind of a weird name, don't get it backwards, was McGeorge Bundy. McGeorge Bundy, this fellow right here. McGeorge Bundy. And he was another Kennedy loyalist. He had been with the Kennedys quite a bit during their political career, but he also was a former professor and actually served time as the Dean of Students at Harvard University. Very bright man. McGeorge Bundy, a Kennedy loyalist and a former professor and former Dean of Students at Harvard University. He will become Kennedy's National Security Advisor. President's got to have a good speechwriter, and he picked a dandy. The guy was very, very good. Theodore Sorensen. Theodore Sorensen was Kennedy's speechwriter. Some of the greatest speeches in American history were developed and put together by Theodore Sorensen, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when you couldn't afford to say things incorrectly. Sorensen was a lawyer and a writer, and he served for a long time in the inner circle of President Kennedy. He was an assistant of Kennedy's during his senatorial years, and he served as a speechwriter for Kennedy all during the 1960 presidential campaign, and will serve in that capacity as president. So he was another Kennedy loyalist. He was in the inner circle of the Kennedy family, a lawyer and a writer, and he was an assistant for Kennedy during his years in the Senate, and he served as the speechwriter during the 1960 presidential campaign for John Kennedy as well. Now, Kennedy actually had two CIA directors. Two. The first one he kind of inherited, and his name was Allen W. Dulles. Allen W. Dulles. John Foster Dulles's? Nope. Brother. Allen W. Dulles was the first CIA director, and Kennedy kind of inherited him. He will be replaced later by John McCone. So when Kennedy takes office, Allen W. Dulles was the CIA director, but he was replaced by John McCone. Now, McCone had some experience. He was the former deputy to the Secretary of Defense under President Truman. So he served as the Secretary of Defense's assistant during the Truman administration. That was John McCone. He was the former deputy to the Secretary of Defense under President Truman. Why did he replace Allen W. Dulles? There was an incident which we'll talk about called the Bay of Pigs, which made Kennedy look very bad because Kennedy was so upset about the CIA intelligence that he received on that operation that he fired Allen Dulles and replaced him with John McCone. And John McCone will be very instrumental during the Cuban Missile Crisis as well. Now, the president really surrounded himself with special assistants. He wanted people loyal to him around him to bounce things off. So he had three very special assistants that served him very well during his presidency. The first one was a guy by the name of Lawrence O'Brien. He was a special assistant to the president. That was his title. Special assistant to the president, Lawrence O'Brien. Here's Lawrence O'Brien right here. And for you basketball fans, after his political career with Kennedy, he ended up being commissioner of the NBA for a long period of time, National Basketball Association. What was his job as special assistant to the president? His job was to communicate with members of Congress for President Kennedy. So if Kennedy needed to get some information or twist some arms in Congress, either the House or the Senate, he would send Lawrence O'Brien there to communicate with those members of Congress in different issues. And like I mentioned, Lawrence O'Brien later became commissioner of the National Basketball Association and will be talked about in detail during the Kennedy assassination. So all these people are important that you remember. Another special assistant to the president was a guy by the name of David Powers. David Powers. And he was the assistant appointments secretary to President Kennedy. The assistant appointments secretary. Assistant appointments secretary. In other words, he helped the appointments secretary set up Kennedy's schedule. Okay? Now, he was a very, very close personal friend of President Kennedy. Very, very close friend. Maybe his best friend. Another very special assistant to the president was a guy by the name of Kenneth ODonnell. You're going to hear an awful lot about him, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Did we name an appointment secretary?
Well, Kennedy did a lot of firsts. We'll talk about that. That's a good point. Okay, he did. And he named an assistant. You know who the appointment secretary was? Kenneth ODonnell. So Kenneth ODonnell, the special assistant to the president, this is a great question. He said, did he name an appointment? He have an assistant appointment secretary. He said, did he name an appointment secretary? Kenneth ODonnell was the appointment secretary. So basically what he did is he created a position of appointment secretary and gave that to Kenneth ODonnell, and then made a position of assistant appointment secretary and gave that to David Powers because he wanted those two guys close to him. Okay? Now, O'Donnell was a little bit different. He was close friends with President Kennedy, but he was almost best friends with Robert Kennedy. So he was very, very close to Robert Kennedy, but also was good friends. This is a very rare picture up here. This one on the top. It's signed, Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye, Memories of John F. Kennedy. Both O'Donnell and Powers, after the president's death, co-authored that book. Johnny, We Hardly Knew Ye, from an Irish implication, and those are both signatures of those guys, very hard to find. Interesting story. I kind of think, oh, it was Shelby Reed. 1 year for Christmas, I gave all the kids a book of Johnny, We Hardly Knew You. I bought them from Amazon one at a time, took forever to get them in because I don't want to buy new ones, I like the older ones. So I don't really pay attention. I get them in, I write a little thing to the kids like I will with you and put them on their desk. And I'll be darned if she was sitting right there. Shelby opens her book and reads the nice thing and opens the next page, and it was signed by David Powers. Don't know how it happened. It's just one of the books I got, you know, from Amazon. Just happened to be signed. Didn't say it was signed. She was all thrilled, so she really did well there. So Kenneth O'Donnell was special assistant to the president. So if we look back at the cabinet of President Kennedy, and obviously there's more people involved, but probably the most important appointment he made was that of Attorney General. Attorney General. Who did he appoint Attorney General? His brother Robert Kennedy. So probably the most important appointment he made was that of Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, his brother. Now this was really a little bit controversial because Robert really only served briefly as a lawyer in the Justice Department prior to his appointment. He really didn't have any legal experience. I mean, he wasn't certainly the best choice because what's the Attorney General do for the President? Advises the President on matters of law. Well, he could have found a heck of a lot more experienced attorneys. But as I mentioned before, Robert was very close to his brother. He was a campaign manager for John Kennedy during every election that he ever ran. And many people were very critical of the choice of Robert Kennedy as Attorney General because, again, he had very little legal experience. So here's the old Kennedy wit coming around again. When the president was kind of hit with that one time, you know, how can you appoint your brother Attorney General when he has no legal experience? When he kind of got hit, he said, quote, "I see nothing wrong with giving Robert some legal experience as Attorney General before he goes out on his own and practices law." I mean, this is the highest position an attorney can have. And he says, "I see nothing wrong with giving Robert some legal experience as Attorney General before he goes out and practices law." He just had a little bit of sarcasm and wit about him that people, how you can argue with that, right? Now, there are three reasons why John Kennedy picked his brother as Attorney General despite the fact he had very little experience as a lawyer. Anybody want to guess one? Yes?
He would be like straight up with him?
He knew he could trust him. Very good. But actually, you can cover both these. He knew he could trust him. No question. Loyal to the, down to the bone. I mean, blood relative loyal. Knew he could trust him. Why else did he pick him? Very close. He knew he would always give him an honest answer. And I'll tell you kind of an example of this. Mr. Smith and I have known each other for 30 years. Mr. Smith knows that if he comes down to me and says, "What do you think I should do here?" I'm going to tell him what I think he should do, and then he has the choice of doing it or not. Okay, right? Or am I going to, if Mr. Smith's doing something that I don't think's right, and he comes to me and says, "Well, what do you think about this?" And because I've not really giving him an honest answer, "Oh yeah, I think that's a good thing because I don't want him mad at me," that isn't how it works. If Mr. Smith comes down, and we've had this conversation, the valedictorian salutatorian policy was one of these knockout dragouts with he and I. And he asked me, and he knew I wouldn't sugarcoat it, that this is what I thought. I would always give him an honest answer of what I thought about something. And he was the same way with me when I was principal, and he was assistant principal. So Mr. Smith and I know I can trust him. I know he's always going to give me an honest answer. Those are the two things that Bobby Kennedy was chosen by his brother because of. He knew he could trust him. He knew he would always give him an honest answer. And Bobby's going to give him an honest answer during the Bay of Pigs, and you're going to understand more what this means. What was the third reason, think about it, that he picked his brother to be Attorney General? He's getting a little pressure to do it. Who was putting the pressure on him? His father. The third reason he did is because Joe Kennedy Sr. pressured him to do that. Put your brother in there. Why should I put my brother in there, Dad? Because you can trust him. Because you know he'll always give you an honest answer. Because you know he'll have an ally when people are after you, when you're getting criticized. You'll have somebody that's close to you.
So outside of Robert Kennedy, was John Kennedy getting fired though for appointing so many people that were so close and like it always been tied to the family?
No, he didn't.